Our hearts and souls determine our eternal destination. The first question we'll be looking at there is this first section, number 1. What are our hearts and what are our souls? Sometimes we think about our hearts and we think about the blood pump. We think about the cardiovascular system. And so we think about blood in relation to that. But when the Bible, thank you very much, gentlemen. When the Bible talks about our hearts, I think I need one maybe. Yeah. When the Bible talks about our hearts, it's talking about something a little bit differently. If you take a look at the first passage there on the handout, take a look at Proverbs 23:7 with me, and you'll see what the Bible has to say regarding the heart of man. And by the way, I'll be using the King James Version, so if my reading is a little bit different, don't worry about that. Some of the blanks may be different. You might have to hear my translation in order to fill it in. But in 23:7 it says, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." And it says, "Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee." The point is this, and point number 1, question number 1, a man can think in his heart. And so when the Bible talks about what man does with his heart, he's not necessarily about it the very core essence of man. He's trying to get at the very core of the human being. And that's what the Bible is really revolving around. It's revolving around the heart of man. But when it uses the word heart, it's using it in an accommodative sense to refer to the very core of the human being, not necessarily talking about the blood pump. And then question number 2, it says our souls or our spirits in some cases. Sometimes those words are interchangeable. It says they refer to the very core of man being eternal, but notice this, they can be lost. A person can lose his soul. A person can lose his spirit. And we'll take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 5 to get the point of this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul's dealing with a very wicked sin that's coming about at the church at Corinth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he's writing in hopes that this soul might be restored. And he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, that it has been reported commonly that there's fornication among the congregation at Corinth, and that such fornication is not even named among the Gentiles. Even the Gentiles look at fornication in the way that it's going about here at Corinth. A certain individual had, as the text says, his father's wife, so possibly a stepmother. And it says, it's not even named in this way among the Gentiles. Even the Gentiles look down on this kind of thing. And he's using the Gentiles to refer to the heathen. And he goes on and he says in 5:2, "But you're puffed up about the thing. You're proud about it." And he says, "My, what a shame." And he goes on in 3, he says, "I verily, though I'm not with you personally, I'm absent in body." He says, "I'm writing though as though I'm right among you. I'm present in spirit." And he says in 5 and verse 3, "I've already commandments of 7." But he says, "I've already made the judgment. The Lord's already judged about this deed." And in verse 5, he pleads with the congregation to deliver such a one unto Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved. Do you see the point there? He is saying that what we do in this body affects what goes on inside. Now there are certain external effects or external circumstances that can draw us either closer or further away, take us further away from God. Sometimes persecution does this to us. And we're persecuted by our friends at school, we're persecuted by our co-workers, and this will do one of two things. It'll either strengthen your faith or destroy your faith. And we've got to allow it to do the latter, to build our faith. If I said, I don't remember. Anyway, in 1 Corinthians 5:5, what Paul's getting at is it's very important that we prepare ourselves, we use our bodies to the glory of God and draw our faith closer to Him. Sometimes we hear people say that what we do in our bodies isn't really a reflection of who we are, but it is. It is. Now, I believe there are certain needs that we have. If you could take the real you out, you draw your real person out of your body and set it over to the side, there are certain needs that vanish. Sexual needs vanish. The need for food vanishes. The need for drink vanishes. There's no need for shelter. All of these human needs go away if you could really take the real you out and set it aside from your body. The point that the Bible's making is what we're doing in our flesh, what we're doing in our lives, truly has an impact on where we'll spend eternity. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul writes, and he says, what you do in your body, whether it's good or bad, that's what it's going to be that's going to be read to you on the day of judgment. And he says, therefore we persuade men. So if we take a look at point number 2 again, Paul said that the spirit might be saved, and therefore the spirit could also be lost. If you take a look at point 3 then, when we think about our hearts and our souls, and we're just thinking about what they are, it's best that we think beyond the physical. And we think about something that's eternal, something that's lasting, something that goes beyond just this physical world that we live in. If you take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we'll appeal to Paul once more. And he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, once again you'll probably need the King James here. I'm not sure how the other versions read. But in 2 Corinthians 4:18 it says, while we look not at the things which are seen, and there's your first blank, but it goes on to say, but we look at the things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not. What Paul is trying to get us to do, what God is trying to get us to do, is take a look at all of the things around us and recognize these things are not lasting. Our bodies are not lasting. Our pews in our buildings are not lasting. The sports we play are not lasting. The schools that we attend are not lasting. But there's something beyond all of this that is eternal. And he's trying to get us to recognize that within the core of man, our hearts, our souls, our spirits, however you want to use those terms, I'm not getting into a real thick definition of all that. But when we talk about the very core of man, there is something here that is lasting beyond the physical realm. He's trying to get us to make preparations for that. Okay, so moving on to point 2. Then we look at what can we do for our hearts and for our souls. How should this affect the way we live? Well, turn over to this passage, and this is one of the more common ones, but take a look at Matthew chapter 6. Beginning in verse 19, Matthew has arranged for us a collection of the ethical teachings of Jesus. And if you really look at Matthew's text, it's not arranged chronologically by any means. He opens the book in a chronological way, closes it in a chronological way, but the rest of the text is arranged thematically. And so in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, what we really have coming from Matthew's pen is a collection of the ethical teachings of Jesus. You read the other Gospels, you'll find these teachings scattered about throughout the chronology of his mission. But in Matthew chapter 6, we run into this little snippet here, beginning in verse 19, where he says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves might break through and steal, but instead lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, where thieves do not break through nor steal. And then he concludes with this, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. If we really think about our lives, we have a God in our lives. I don't know what it is. And you may think, well, truly, Drew's God is God. Truly, the God he serves is Jehovah God. But what if I fooled you? What if you think, oh, well, maybe Drew just does the work at Cherokee, not really because he loves God, not really because he loves preaching the truth, but maybe because he just loves the paycheck. Or maybe you might think, well, the real reason Drew goes to church is because his family goes to church and he just wants to be in with his family or his friends. He wants to fit in. That's where the social crowd he hangs with goes, so he goes that way. Maybe that's the case. We have a God that we serve, and maybe it's not Jehovah God. Maybe it is our Little League baseball team. Maybe it is our occupation. But whatever the case is, God is trying to get to us. And the only way that I know God can speak to me in a personal, direct way, and I'm using words here that kind of are out of place, but it's through the Scriptures. He's not going to come to me through a divine revelation beyond or extra biblically. It's going to be through the Scriptures that He's going to motivate me to do what's right. And that's what he teaches in Hebrews 4:12. He teaches that in 2 Corinthians 3. He's given us the text in order for us to know how to grow closer to God. So when we ask ourselves, what truly is my God in this world? Is it Jehovah God? Is it something that's physical or temporal? What's the case? You've got to be honest with yourself. I've got to be honest with myself. And if it's not Jehovah God, we've got to get it right. We've got to rearrange. We've got to make an adjustment. And so when we take a look at Matthew 6:19 through 21, what's he pleading for us to do? Well, here it is. Make your treasure and make your heart in heaven. Put your treasure in heaven, and your heart will be there. Put your heart in heaven, and your treasure will be there. See, if I really have my heart in the right place, what's naturally going to follow? Well, that's where I'm going to pour my time, my energy, my efforts. That's where my heart's going to be, and that's where my treasure's going to be. And the same as the alternative. You put your treasure in heaven, you can't divorce your heart from it. The two go hand in hand. But then it's odd that sometimes people make the claim our hearts or our treasure is in heaven, and then the alternative is not really the case, and we find out maybe it's not the case to begin with. Last year, when we first moved out here, Hannah and I did, and I guess it was about a month in, Central had their Men's Day, early August maybe, and Jim Dearman, I think, was the first speaker on the program. And he talked about this passage. That was his passage to speak on. And he talked about a translation that he thought was accurate of Matthew 6:21, which came out to this conclusion. If we read it in the King James, it says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. But he read a translation, or maybe it was a paraphrase, that said, for where your treasure is, your heart is already there. That's pretty good. And that really captures the meaning of the text. It's going to follow that where your treasure is, you're going to see your heart all wrapped up in that. People who are devoted to a cause or devoted to some effort, you see where their heart lies. You see where their treasure is. People who play professional baseball, you can see where their passion lies. People who serve our Lord God Jehovah, you see where their treasure lies. You see where their heart is. And so we've got to make sure that we're being honest with our God, that really is where our treasure and our heart belongs. If you take a look at point number 4b here, and you might know this when we sang a song, so if you don't know it, just think back to the song we just sang a couple moments ago. Seek the kingdom first. If ever you talk to our youth, I think we would do well to stress this above anything else. Because if you really capture the meaning of seeking the kingdom or the reign of God first, you'll have it made. Sometimes we put other things before God, and that becomes our God. But you put the kingdom, you put the reign of God first, and you're going to see that He's going to be number one in your life. The third point is this then, thinking on good things. And that's Philippians 4:8. We read that passage and he says, whatsoever things are, and he goes on to list all of these things for us. And then Paul concludes, let's turn over there to Philippians chapter 4 for a brief moment. He concludes with, we ought to be thinking on these things. If you take a look at the section, the paragraph in Philippians chapter 4, Paul is writing from a Roman cell. He is writing from captivity. And things don't look good for him if he's only thinking from the external perspective. He's in prison. He's not really in the best of places. It's not too bad sometimes if you look at the book of Acts, Acts chapter 28. I mean, he's in his own hired house at one point in the Roman cell, the first time he's in Rome. But if you look at Philippians, he's still in a cell. He still doesn't have the freedom like you and I have to walk about and do the things that he would like to do. He's in a Roman prison. Well, in Philippians chapter 4, he recognizes even though he's separate from all these men, he's separate from society, he concludes in Philippians 4 verse 5, the Lord is at hand. What's he talking about? I think he's got the same kind of thing in mind as Jeremiah 23:23, where it says, am I not a God that's close at hand and not distant? Even though Paul is cut off from all of the society, he's actually grown closer to God. You put God first, and even through the darkest of circumstances, you can grow closer to your God. And he says this in Philippians 4. He goes on. In verse 6, he says, don't be anxious for anything, But in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. Are you struggling? Are you struggling with putting the kingdom first? Are you struggling with putting God first? Well, have you prayed about it? Talked to an individual yesterday, and she's going through some transitions in her life. She's going through a very big time, and there's this time where we move out of Mommy and Daddy's house, and we start to become our own people. You know what I mean? There's going to come a day where you're going to look back at your house for the first and last time. The first time being, this is the first time you're moving out on your own. And the last time you look back at your house and you're going to say, I'll never live in Mommy and Daddy's house again. And boy, you talk about a strange feeling. I'm sure that some of you other people have had that feeling. It's a bizarre feeling. I remember it. Last year I moved out of my parents' house and I thought, man, this is different. This is strange. And for the first time, you're going to be out on your own. And we go through these transitions in life. And sometimes it's hard for us to keep our focus where it should be. Sometimes it's tough for us not to be anxious and worry about things. But then I asked this certain individual this question. I said, well, I know you're going through a lot. I know the transition's going to be tough. I understand it already is tough. But have you prayed about it? And the question hangs in the air for us. You go through tough times, what's the first thing you ought to do? Hit your knees. Ask God about it. And so in Philippians 4:6, Paul says he'd been praying. And he says in verse 7, the peace of God, it passes our understanding. There's something deeper in this life than just our physical view. To look out into the world, sometimes we see things and they look dark, they look bleak, but there's something beyond. And so in verse 8, he goes through it and he says, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, good report. If there's any virtue, he says, if there's any praise, think on these things. Well, that's easy for Paul. He had direct revelation from God. Well, that's easy from Paul. He could work miracles. That's easy from Paul. He was beloved among all the churches in the first century, which isn't entirely true. But here's the thing. Paul is writing from a Roman cell. And in a dark situation, he tells us to think on good things. He tells the saints in the first century who have their freedom to think on good things. Usually it's the other way around. You and I who have our freedom, and we have a comfortable lifestyle, and we live in luxury, and we do, being in the United States. We live in luxury. It's usually the case that we're the ones who encourage the others, and we tell them who are in the hospital, and we tell them who are in the jail cells overseas. We say, hey, be strong. We're going to encourage you. But instead, here's the one who's being oppressed, writing back to those of us who live luxuriously, and he tells us, be strong. He encourages us. Do you see the obverse point being made? He's writing to us who live luxuriously, and he tells us to think on good things. Sometimes we have a problem, and we always look down upon things. We look at things negatively, and we gripe, and we complain, and we fuss, and nothing's ever right in the world. You know what I mean? And then Paul, who could have been making those kind of things, tells us, you have it good. Think on good things. Think positively. In this same epistle, turn back to this. Look at Philippians 2:14. He's already written to them about a past event, it seems to me. Maybe he's taking a direct dig at the congregation there for something. It seems that this theme surfaces multiple times in the Philippian text. But he says in 2:14, do all things without murmurings and disputings. You think you've got it bad? You think you've got it rough, Drew? Paul had it a little worse, and he said, think positively. Stop murmuring. Stop complaining. And he says in 4 then, think on the good things. Don't think about all the bad. Put these things out of your mind and move forward with what God has granted us for good. Okay, we move on to question number 5 then. What can we do for our hearts and our souls? We're talking about making preparation for these things. But in question 5 it says we can have good heroes like, and here's Ezra 7:10. For Ezra prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments. Talk about a hero. Here's your hero. Ezra the scribe, Ezra the priest. Somebody who looked at his life and he said, I'm going to make preparation. I'm going to look at my heart, I'm going to look at my life, and I'm going to set everything up so that I can please God first. Here's a second blank on that point. What about Daniel? In Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 it says the same kind of thing. Daniel prepared his heart. But look at what he's up against. Go to Daniel chapter 1 with me for a moment. And look at what he's facing. You talk about somebody who's up against the wall. We sometimes think that we've got it rough and we can't be faithful because there are certain coworkers or certain friends who press at us. And they say, oh, you can't be faithful to God. You can't do this right. And so we cave. We cave to the pressure. And we give in and we say, oh, the world's got it right. They know this stuff. The world's smart. They know. And we cave. We give in. But in Daniel 1, he's not up against a coworker. He's not up against a friend. He is up against the leader of the land, the king of the world, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Nobody is more powerful than this man, so it would seem. Nobody trumps Nebuchadnezzar. And so in Daniel 1, look at what the request is. In verse 5, the king says, hey, I've got an idea. Let's make a daily provision. And he says, we'll give them the king's meat. We'll give them the wine, which even I drink, the king says. And so by nourishing them 3 years, they might stand at the end of this testing period of 3 years, they might be able to stand before the king. And they'll stand fit and whole. And the king will be very impressed with their physical attributes. It would seem, given our reading of the text, that eating this meat and drinking this beverage was not scriptural for Daniel. Maybe it was the case that this meat had been offered to idols. Maybe it was the case that this meat was one of those quote-unquote unclean meats under the Levitical law. And then maybe that alcohol was just what it is. Maybe it was alcohol. Or maybe it was not alcohol. Maybe it was just fruit of the vine. But maybe it had been offered to idols as a drink offering. Whatever the case, it would seem that Daniel is not authorized to partake of the king's meat and the king's drink. And so look at what's stated in 1:8. Daniel had purposed in his heart. Not talking about the blood pump there. It's talking about, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Daniel purposed in his heart. Mentally, it's talking about. He had made a decision that he's going to serve God. And it says in 1:8, he had purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. What Daniel is determined to do is to set his heart on things above. He's determined to set his heart towards the affection of the things of God rather than the things of men. Well, what about, it's Nebuchadnezzar, it's the king of the world. He's the one demanding this. He's the one telling us we've got to get it right. He's the one telling us to eat the meat and drink the drink. And Nebuchadnezzar later in this text is going to find out he's not the king of the world. He doesn't reign. It's Jehovah God. You might be acquainted with Daniel chapter 2, where King Nebuchadnezzar gets this vision. He gets this dream. And he sees the 4 world empires. And at the end of the thing, Daniel comes in and does a one-up on the Chaldeans, the wise men, the caste of wise men that existed within the Babylonian province. And in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel, who's also called Belteshazzar, comes in and interprets the dream. And watch what 2:46 says. If you look over at chapter 2, in Daniel 2:46, after he's finished interpreting the dream, King Nebuchadnezzar, who's supposed to be the best, he's supposed to be the boss, he falls upon his face and does obeisance towards Daniel. And it says in 2:46, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. And the king then makes this declaration, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing that you could reveal this secret. And then this is an ironic phrase in 48. Then the king made Daniel a great man. What's funny about that? From whose perspective? Not Daniel's. Definitely not God's. Daniel already was a great man. How did the king make him great? This is from the worldly perspective. Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, takes him and sets him up and gives him these certain official titles and sets him above in the wise men caste and sets him up as being this official ruler now. But the point is this, Daniel was already great. Friends, don't let the world tell you that you've got to go about it their way in order to be a great man. You can be a great man without the world's approval. If you don't believe that, our Master did it first. Our Lord, our Master, walked upon this planet. And if you think they nailed him to a tree because he just went along with everything, you're dead wrong. Something he did started controversy. Something he said didn't go along with the accepted mold. Go ahead, friends, young people, older people, go ahead and determine whatever you do, you're going to love God. And if the world doesn't go along with it, go with God first. You'll be a great man. And no matter where the world puts you in their line of things, you'll still be a great man. Daniel learned this lesson, and he learned it in the toughest of circumstances. If he can go up against the leader of the world, you and I can go up against our friends, and we can go up against our co-workers and say, this is what truth is, whether you like it or not. We take a look at the next blank, and we have Genesis 41:16. You may not know exactly who that's talking about. The others were relatively easy. Your reference came from Ezra, so it was Ezra. The reference came from Daniel, so it was Daniel. The third character here is not Genesis. But in Genesis 41:16, look at this. We find another young man who's up against the wall. And, if you're acquainted with this narrative, you really know this guy's been through it too. In 41:14, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, here's the most powerful ruler of the day in this time frame. The Pharaoh, king of Egypt, called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And so he knows he's coming before the king, and so he shaves himself. He gets a different raiment. He clothes up and came in unto Pharaoh. In verse 15, Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream. There's none that can interpret it, and I've heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And it says in verse 16, Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. It's not in me. It is in God. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Be like Joseph. And there's our third blank. Remember that when we're really going through it, and the circumstances may look bad, give it to God. Give the glory to God. Whatever we do in that circumstance, as long as we're faithful, give the glory to God. So you're hurting on finances. Somehow, anyway, you find a $5 bill to give to the work of the Lord somehow. Somebody says, oh, that's mighty good of you. Yeah, well, that's God's work. No, of course, we're the instrument whereby God accomplishes it. But that's God's work. This is His doing. And we ought to give the glory to Him for that. If we think back now about Joseph and where he came from, it would seem in Genesis 37 that he is first in his father's house. He's the one who gets the cloak or the coat that's colorful. He's the one that the Lord comes to in the dreams and gives him a vision. He's the one then that tells his brothers the interpretation of these dreams, or starts to relay those to them at least at that point, maybe not knowing the meaning yet. And then his brothers don't necessarily like that. They don't like the favor that he's been getting. And so in Genesis 39, what happens? He finds himself going towards Potiphar's house. He's been thrown into a pit. His brothers show up, and this is interesting, they show up with this coat that he had. The father, Jacob, knowing full well whose coat it was. And they show up with the coat, and it's got blood of an animal on it. And they show up with a coat and a little extra money, and Joseph's nowhere to be found. The father, Jacob, starts to think, apparently, my son is dead. He goes into this pit and gets sold into slavery. He finds himself then being sold into Potiphar's house. And while he's there, he gets falsely accused of lying seductively with Potiphar's wife. He gets cast into prison. And then he interprets some dreams for the baker and the butler. 2 years go by, and the Pharaoh hears this man can interpret dreams. And Pharaoh now calls him out. Look at all those bad circumstances. Cast into a pit, sold into slavery, cast into prison, and then after all this time passes, the Pharaoh calls for him to come out and interpret his dream, and he says, by the way, whatever's been happening, it's the Lord's work. Whatever goes on in our life, whether the circumstances be good or bad, never forget to seek God first, to get your heart or your soul aligned with God, and keeping Him above all. Take a look at the next blank then. Have good friends. This is true for young people as well as it is for old people. Look, your friends impact you. Don't ever sell that point short. I know it's trivial somewhat. We look at it that way. We look at it as a trivial point, or we look at it as just a casual point. But truly, the people we associate with will affect who we are. I've talked to several individuals, young people that have then grown up, and they grow up and they're addicted to drugs, they're addicted to alcohol, they're running with a lot of filthiness. And if you ask these individuals why it is that they're involved in this kind of mess, you know why they usually say? It started because of a crowd they ran with. Never sell that point short. Never underestimate that when you run with an ungodly crowd, it will affect who you are. It is much tougher to build people up than it is for people to tear you down. It is also tougher to clean up spilled milk than for people to spill it. It takes just a moment to knock that glass over, and the mess is there. It takes a whole lot more effort to clean all that up. The same is true spiritually. Don't let your life become a mess. Don't let it become spilled milk and take a long time to clean up. Try to keep it on the right track as easily as possible by hanging with good friends, hanging with good company. In 1 Corinthians 15:33, we hear Paul tell us that our companions affect our morals. But then our good friends can be these, like, I'm just going to read these off to you. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are the Babylonian names of the young men, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, from the book of Daniel. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are good friends. We can have friends like them. Or David and Jonathan. You might remember how close they were. David and Jonathan were good friends with each other. And so if one would have gone off into error, what do you think the other would have done? He would have tried to help out. Brother, I think you're falling here. And so we need to make sure we've got friends that if we get into a mess, we can truly rely on good friends to help drag us out of it and say, look, we're going to help you. We're going to get you out. We'll look at our third section then. What can we expect then for our hearts and our souls in eternity? Really, if you survey the biblical data, there's really not a whole lot on the topic of heaven. Nor is there really a whole lot on the topic of hell. But there's enough. There's enough to tell us where we want to go, and there's enough to tell us where we don't want to go. And so I need you to listen here for probably the translation if you're not using the King James Version. Because 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4 I'm sure reads a little bit differently, and the blanks fit the King James Version. In 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter's writing about this fiery trial that's going to come upon the church in the first century. It would seem to me, given the fact that he's writing to Palestine and to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, it would seem that he's writing about AD 70, the fall of Jerusalem, that would come at the hands of the Romans. And so in 1 Peter chapter 1, he writes to them, and before he ever talks about that crisis, before he ever talks about the Roman armies invading the land, he assures those that are faithful to God of what they might experience if they remain faithful. And so he says in 1:3, Blessed be the God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to His abundant mercy hath begotten us into a lively hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That's the motivator, that's the cause, that's the origin. Why do we have hope? Oh, by the way, it's because of the resurrection of the dead. Jesus Christ specifically. And then he says this in 1:4. Here's your first blank. To an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled. There's your second blank. Expect an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that fadeth not away. There are your next two blanks. That fadeth not away. And then the text ends, reserved in heaven for you. And he's writing about a place. He doesn't give us a whole lot of details. But he's writing about somewhere where God is. Somewhere where hope lives on. Somewhere beyond what we see here. Somewhere beyond the crisis. The crisis that we face in our lives, whatever it may be, is one that Peter, if we transpose his text into a different key, he's writing to you, he's writing to me. And he's saying there's something beyond this. And then in our last blank, but our eternal destination depends on our... You won't find this word in the text, but we'll read this text and we'll close with it. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and look at what Paul has to say. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24, he says, "Don't you know that they which run in a race run all, but only one receives the prize? How about you run that you can obtain? Every man that strives for the mastery," he's talking about the Grecian games, it would seem, "is temperate in all things." He's patient. He goes about it in a way that's determined. And it says, they do it, though, to obtain a corruptible crown. But we, Christians, we strive for an incorruptible crown. Something that won't ever fade away. The leaves in our crown won't fade because they're out of season. They're going to constantly be there, constantly living on. And he says in 26, "Therefore I run." He keeps under his body, verse 27. And so why is he doing this? What's he talking about? Here's our blank. Goal. 1 Corinthians 9:24 through 27 teaches us to set our goal at the right place, in the right spot. And in Philippians chapter 3:14, Paul writes, he says, "There's a mark that I've set up." He's got a goal. That's why he runs. That's where he's running. He runs because he's got his goal set up right. What have we learned? First, we've learned this. We've learned that our hearts and our souls, when the Bible talks about them, sometimes it talks about the blood pump. Sometimes it gets at that when it talks about our heart. But sometimes it uses the language to refer to the inner part of man. The real Drew. The real human being. The second thing that we learn is we can do something about it. What we do in our lives, what we do in our flesh, affects where we spend eternity. And the third thing we've learned is this. Make sure we're setting our affections on things above. Make sure our hearts are in tune with God, and we truly seek heaven and the kingdom of God first. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time.